Alright, in this section we're going to start working with Blender. We've gone through all the boring crap, all the primers, the user preferences, and all that. Now it's time to start getting our hands dirty and actually creating things. So the first thing I'll show you how to do is transform objects, to move them around, rotate them, and scale them, and things like that. And I'm also going to show you how to add different objects and lots of other options you have in this mode. So object mode is basically the default mode. You can just click around and select objects, as opposed to edit mode, which we'll be working with in the next chapter, where we can actually go into mesh objects and move their elements around and change their shape and draw our own shapes and our own models. But for starters, we're working in object mode, so let me show you how to move this cube around. So right click on the cube to select it. To move it around, we press the G key for grab. And to confirm this movement, you can left click, or if you don't want to move it, you can right click and it'll go back to its original position. Now to rotate the cube, you can press the R key. And to scale the cube, you press the S key. Now movement and rotation are based on the view you're in. So for example, if I go into front view and I rotate the cube, you see that it's rotating only on the y-axis. And if I press the G key to move it around, it's only going to be moving on the Z and the x-axis. Now one cool thing about rotation is no matter what view you're in, if you press R once and then press it again, you'll get into something called trackball rotation, which basically allows you to rotate the cube on every axis no matter what view you're in. So to recap, to move is G, to rotate is R, and to scale is S. Those are the basic tools you need to know to basically create anything. One more thing to note real quickly is that when you're rotating and scaling the object, it's going to rotate and scale based on the origin. So if I press R to rotate it, you'll see that it's rotating around that orange point at the center of the cube, which is its origin. And same thing goes with scaling. It's going to scale from that origin point. So just keep that in mind. We'll be working more with origin stuff and 3D cursor stuff later on. But for now, just know that when you rotate or scale, it will do it based on the origin. Now for those of you that are used to using the manipulator object or the manipulator tool, let's enable that real quick and I'll show you real quick how it works and what it does. So in the header of the 3D view, enable this red, blue, and green icon and you'll see the manipulator pop up on the cube. Now by default, movement arrows are displayed on the manipulator, and you can simply left click on it. If you left click on each of the arrows, it will move the cube based on that axis. And in the 3D header, you'll see other icons here. One is the arrow, that's for movements. The one next to that is a curve, that's for rotations. So you can click on any of those colored circles to rotate it on that axis. And the last one here with square handles is for scaling. So you can just left click on any of those cubes and it will scale it on that axis. To enable all these at once, or just one or two or three of these at once, hold the Shift key and left click on each of those icons. So right now I have them all enabled. So I can move it, or scale it, or rotate it however I want. But this thing is really an eyesore, so I like to keep that disabled. I'll show you a different way to constrain movement, rotation, and scaling to different axes. But first, let's clear the location, rotation, and scale of the cube to get it back to its original setting. To clear rotation of an object, which means to revert it back to its original orientation, you press Alt and R. And the same thing with scaling and movement. Press Alt and S to clear its scale, and press Alt and G to clear its movement. So now we're left with our original cube. Now let's learn how to transform based on an axis. With the cube still selected, press the G key, and now we're moving it around. Now press the X key. Now we can only move it on the x-axis, so we just constrain the movement to the x-axis. You can also press the Y key or the Z key, and it'll move it just on that one axis. Now if you press the R key, we can do the same thing. Rotate it on the Z-axis by pressing the Z key, Y-axis, or X-axis. And of course the same goes for scaling. Now this is very useful if you're, say, working in a scene that has a floor and lots of objects are on the floor. You can go into front view, and let's say this red line here is our floor. So I'm going to move that cube right on the floor there. Now say I want to move this cube all the way over to the left, but I don't want it to lift off the floor at all. So to move it perfectly horizontal, I go to front view and press the G key and then the X key, and I can move it perfectly horizontal sideways. Now let's say I changed my mind. I moved it over there. I don't want it to be over there anymore. Blender has an undo just like every other program, and it's Control and Z like most programs. And redo is Control, Shift, and Z. So let me go over one more tool with our regular transformations here, and it's called snapping. Snapping makes use of the grid behind it when you're moving an object. So if you press G to move the cube, and you hold the Control button, you'll see the cube is moving based on the grid behind it. It's moving in perfect increments. And if you take a look at the bottom of the 3D header, you can see exactly how far you're moving something or rotating it or scaling it. So all the transform information will be down there. And holding Control also works for rotation. So if you're rotating it now and you look at the bottom of the 3D view in the header on the left, you'll see it's not rotating in perfect increments. But if you hold the Control key, it will rotate at 5 degrees at a time. And the same works for scaling. Press the S key, hold the Control key, and it will scale in perfect increments. So whenever you're creating something where dimensions or proportions are important, using the Control key to snap things to perfect increments is going to be very useful. Now let's work on adding some new objects. First, let's delete this cube by pressing the X key to bring up our delete menu, and then left click to confirm that delete. You'll see this cursor at the center of the world. This is called the 3D cursor. And wherever we place that cursor by left clicking is where our new object is going to be added. So let's place the cursor up over there. Press Shift and A for the Add menu. And you can also find the Add menu in the top of Blender in the menu here. But the hotkey for it is Shift and A. Under the Mesh menu, let's add a Mesh UV sphere. You can see that it added the sphere right where the 3D cursor was. So now we have this disco ball looking sphere over here. And just real quick, I want to smooth that out because I don't want it to look like a disco ball. I want it to look like a smooth ball that you throw around. If you press the T key to open up the toolbar on the left side, you'll see all these different object tools. Also at the bottom here, for the sphere that we just added, we have all these different options for changing its resolution and changing its size. So whenever you add a new object, and this also works with a lot of different tools that you use, lots of options will appear on the left side of this toolbar at the bottom. So we can change how many segments the sphere has and how many rings, and it just basically makes it a more detailed sphere. Makes it smoother. And where I'm getting at now though is I want to smooth out this sphere because it's looking very faceted. So on the toolbar on the left, under the shading options, click on Smooth. And now we just smoothed out our sphere. Of course, you can bring the disco ball look back by pressing the flat button. So we can smooth it out by pressing the smooth button, or make it look like a disco ball by pressing the flat button. Now let's place the 3D cursor over there by left clicking there. And let's add back in a mesh cube. Now what would happen if we clicked on smooth for the cube? Because of all those 90 degrees, it's very hard to shade smooth. That's why it looks weird like that. So for things of a boxy nature, it's best to leave flat shading on. Alright, so let's hide this toolbar on the left by pressing the T key again. And you can access that either by pressing the T key or by pressing the plus sign up here. Then close it by sliding it over. So we've got a couple objects in our scene now. Let's add a few more interesting objects. Press Shift and A, and let's add a mesh cylinder. Move it over there, and let's add a mesh monkey. So here we have a little collection of objects. I'm going to press the T key again and press smooth for the monkey head. So whatever object is selected, you can press smooth and it will smooth it out. And you can also select multiple objects and it works the same on both of them at the same time. Now let me show you how you can go about selecting things in different ways. First, you know the basic selection is right-clicking on the object. You can also hold Shift and right-click and you'll select multiple objects. And then if you continue holding Shift and right-click on objects that are already selected twice, it will deselect them. If you press the B key, this tool is called Box Select. So if you press the B key and then left click and drag, anything under this box will become selected. If you press the B key again and middle click instead of left click, then anything under this box will be deselected. And pretty much the same goes for the next tool, which is Circle Select. So press the C key and you'll have this circle selection right here. Now anything you left click over will become selected, and anything you middle click over will become deselected. And with this tool you can actually change the size of the selection by using the scroll wheel on your mouse. And to cancel out of Box Select or Circle Select, you simply right click. Now I have the head selected, the sphere, and the camera. But say I want all those deselected and I want everything else selected. So this is called inverse selection. If you press Control and I, it will inverse your selection. So it will select everything that's not already selected, and it will deselect the things that are selected. And all of these selection options, if you forget the hotkeys for them, you can find it in the header of the 3D view under the Select menu. So in here you'll see you have Border Select, or I called it Box Select, Circle Select, Deselect All, Inverse, and even Random Select. And that's one thing I didn't mention yet, is how to select everything and how to select nothing. So if there are objects selected in your scene and you press the A key, it will deselect everything. And if there's nothing selected and you press the A key again, it will select everything in the scene. And that's all there is to selecting objects. I bet you didn't know there were so many different ways to select something. Well, there are. And you'll pretty much be using all of them. Now one last thing. Say we really like this monkey head and we want to put it all around our scene. You can select the monkey head by right-clicking on it and then press Shift and D and it will make a full copy of it. So I just made 4 copies of our original monkey head. Now I'm going to show you how parenting works. Now parenting is just a way to get one object to follow another, much like a child follows a parent. So in this little scene I've created here, we have a door that can swing open and closed. However, you'll notice that the doorknob does not swing with it. That's because it's a separate object. So what we want to do is simply parent the doorknob to the door so that it swings open with it. To do that, press the Z key so we can go into wireframe view. That way we can see the objects better. And right-click on the doorknob, hold Shift, and right-click on the door. Now press Ctrl and P to parent the doorknob to the door and select Object. Now a little black line appears that stretches from the doorknob's origin point all the way over to the door's origin point. This line is called a relationship line, and it basically just tells you that there is some kind of relationship between the doorknob and the door. In this case, it's a parent and child relationship. So now that we've parented the doorknob to the door, we can select the door and rotate that open on the Z-axis, and you'll see the doorknob goes with it like it should. Yet they're still two separate objects. The doorknob is just going to copy the motions and any kind of transformation of the door. And that's how parenting works. It's as easy as that. It's just a way to get one object to copy the movements, rotations, and scales of another object. Now one thing to note when parenting is that the parent object will always be the last object you select. That's why we selected the doorknob first and we selected the door second. You will notice that they're both two different shades of orange. The brighter shade of orange is the last object you selected, or what's called the active selection. This becomes the parent. The doorknob is a darker orange because that was one of the first objects we selected. So this is called the inactive selection. So the last selection you make, or the current selection, is always going to be the parent. So that's just an explanation of why you might see two different shades, of why you will see two different shades of orange when you're selecting multiple objects. So just keep in mind when parenting that the last object you select will always become the parent, and everything else will be the child. Now another way to get the doorknob to swing open with the door is to join them both into one single object. To do that, select one object, hold Shift, select the other object, and press Ctrl and J to join them together. Now they are just one single object, no parenting needed. So when we rotate the door open and closed, the doorknob's going to follow the door because it's part of the same object. So that hotkey again was Ctrl and J. It will join all meshes that you have selected together into one mesh. Now before we move on to an exercise, we're going to go over just a few more tips for working in object mode. One of them is hiding and unhiding objects. So we have a bit of a scene here. It's not too complex, but the wall, the floor, and the door frame did get in our way of parenting the doorknob to the door. It was just harder to focus on those two elements. So let's hide a few things. So I'm going to right click on the wall and I'm going to press H to hide it. Same thing with the floor. I'm going to press H to hide the floor, and I'm going to select the door frame and press H to hide that. Now that just makes those objects invisible. We didn't delete them or anything. So now we're just working with our door here. And when we're finished working with the door, you can press Alt and H to unhide all of those objects. So again, those hotkeys are H and Alt and H. And another way to kind of hide these objects is to move them to a different layer. Now we went over layers briefly, and now we're going to see firsthand how useful they can be. So I'm going to select all of the objects except for the door and the doorknob. And I'm going to press M to move it to a different layer, and I'm going to move it to layer 2. There. So now if you look in the 3D header, you can see there's a dot on layer 1 and layer 2. That means that both of those layers have objects in them. But only layer 1 is active or visible. If we hold Shift and select layer 2, now both of those layers are visible. This way we can work with one layer at a time simply by left-clicking on the layer to make it visible. So layer 1 just contains the door and the doorknob. So we can play around with the door, do whatever we need to it, and then in the end, just hold Shift and left-click on layer 2 to bring everything together. Or of course, to make all layers visible, you can press the tilde key in the top left of the keyboard next to the 1 key. That makes all layers visible. Now one last note before we move on is that every object has its own name, and you can see the object's name by selecting it and looking in the lower left corner of the 3D view next to the axis. The number next to the object name is the frame number, so that's for animation. But the object's name is right next to that, so every object that you select, its name will appear in the bottom left. And you can change the object's name by going to the Object buttons, which is the cube icon. And the top field here is the object name, so we can rename this to anything we want. And this is going to be important later on when we're using things like modifiers that target certain objects in the scene that we have to call by name. So it's not only a way of organizing your scene, but it's actually going to be useful later on. Now you know all the basics of working in object mode, so let's move on to actually creating a scene. Alright, in the exercise here, here's what we're going to do. We're going to use all the primitive meshes that we can, all the basic shapes that Blender gives us, to create a fun little scene. We're going to make a classic castle. We're going to use cubes for the walls, we're just going to stretch them out, and we're going to use cylinders on each of the four corners with cones on top, just to make it a little stylish. It's going to be very simple to make, but we're going to spruce it up, I promise. It's going to be a fun little scene in the end. So, I guess the first thing we'll do is start with this cube here. So go to top view by pressing the 7 key on your numpad, and if you have a bit of perspective like this, then press the 5 key on the numpad, so we have orthographic view. And we learned how to stretch things out or scale based on an axis earlier in this chapter. So press the S key while the cube is selected, and then press the Y key so we can squash it into the thinness of the wall that we want. And then press the S key again, and then press the X key to constrain it to the X-axis. And left click to confirm that. Now in front view, let's stretch this tall. We want this wall to be a bit taller. So press the S key and the Z key to stretch it tall. And the hotkey for front view again, by the way, is numpad 1. So press the S key and then the Z key to stretch it tall like that. And let's pretend this red line here is the ground for our world. So I'm just going to move this wall up onto that red line by pressing the G key and then the Z key to move it straight up. There's our first wall. Now we're just going to make 3 other walls by duplicating this and rotating it. So with the wall selected, in top view, press Shift and D to duplicate it, and then press the R key to rotate it in place, and hold the Control key to rotate it perfectly 90 degrees. And let's move that up and to the left over here to meet with the corner of the other wall. Now press Shift and D to duplicate that again, and press the X key so that we can move it perfectly horizontal to the other side. Now select the front wall, press Shift and D one more time, and then press the Y key to move it perfectly vertical. So now we have our 4 walls. Now let's add those corner towers. In top view, I'm going to place the cursor over there in the corner of these 2 walls, because that's where I want my cylinder to be added. Now press Shift and A to add a mesh cylinder. In front view, let's move that up on the Z-axis by pressing G and then Z, and then press S and then Z to scale it taller. We want it to be about that tall. And let's move it up on the Z-axis again so that it sits on that red line. That looks about right. Now in top view again, and I'm going in and out of wireframe and solid shading by pressing the Z key. It's just that some views are easier to work in, like wireframe view is easier than solid shading sometimes because you can see through everything. So I'm just going in and out of that view based on my own preference. Anyway, in top view, with that 3D cursor still where the cylinder is, press Shift and A again and add a mesh cone. In front view, let's move that up on the Z-axis and press S to scale it. And let's sit it right on top of that cylinder. It can intersect a little. So there's our corner tower for our castle. Now I'm going to join these two objects together, and then we're going to duplicate it around the other three corners. So select the cone, hold cylinder, and press Ctrl and J to join them together into one object. Now I want all of these edges here to be smoothed out. So press the T key so that we can get those shading options again. And with the tower selected, press Smooth. And you'll see it's got some weird shading. Like because with the cube we tried to smooth out earlier, these sharp angles on the bottom and top, on the bottom edge of the cylinder and the bottom edge of the cone, they're not going to be shaded that great because those angles are way too sharp. But we can fix that easily by adding a modifier called Edge Split. So let's add that real quick and then I'll explain exactly what it does. So with the tower still selected, let's press T to get rid of that side menu. And let's stretch this out so we can work with our properties window now. To add the modifier for this tower, we got to go up into the modifier options, the modifier buttons, which is this wrench icon. If you left click on that, you'll have a modifier menu here. Left click on that and you have tons of options here, but we want to just look at one right now. I'm going to go over a lot of these later. But the one we want right now is called Edge Split, and it's under the Generate options. So left click on Edge Split, and you'll see that without even changing any of these options, it fixed our problem completely. Now let me explain to you what just happened. Basically, the angle specified here, any angle over that amount is going to be separated away from the object so that it can be shaded separately. So basically, the Edge Split modifier just separated the bottom part of the cylinder and the bottom part of the cone, and then it smoothed everything else out. And that's basically how that works. So now let's take this tower and let's duplicate it around the four edges. So in top view, with the tower selected, press Shift and D, and then press the Y key so that we can move it perfectly up to that corner. Now hold Shift and let's duplicate these both at the same time. So with them both selected, press Shift and D again, and then press the X key, and let's move those two towers over to the other two corners. There we have our basic castle. But it's a little boring. So what I want to do now is just add a simple little primitive army attacking it with some spears. And then we're going to change the camera to be in a more dramatic view, and then we're going to set this thing up for a render. Now we're going to add a drawbridge door so that this advancing army has something to throw their spears at. So let's do that the same way we made the walls of the castle, by stretching out a cube. So in top view, place the 3D cursor somewhere near the center of the front wall. Press Shift and A and add a mesh cube. Now zoom in real close and press the S key and the Y key to squash it down into a plank of wood. Now in front view, move that up and let's press the S key again and the X key to squash it down this way. And let me give you one more tip when constraining to an axis. If you press the S key and you're moving the mouse to the left, you can middle click and it'll constrain to that axis. Same works if you're moving the mouse up, you can constrain it to that axis. So the middle mouse button acts as picking an axis, and that works with movement and rotation as well. So let's squash it on the x-axis so that we have one plank of wood, just like that. I'm going to move that down so it sits on the red line. And I'm going to press Shift D and move that over on the x-axis with just a tiny gap in between the planks there. And we're going to do that again. Press Shift D, move it over on the x-axis, leaving a tiny little gap. And do that a few more times until you have a door that's as wide as you want it to be. And one more tip for moving things around or rotating and scaling. You can actually use the arrow keys to move it around with a little bit more control. So right now I'm pressing the left and right arrow key to move that into position. So that's about as wide as I want our door to be. Now to hold all these planks together, let's add some cross beams. So duplicate that last plank there and right click so that you don't move it anywhere, and press the R button to rotate it. Hold Control and rotate it perfectly 90 degrees. Let's move that into place about right there. Leave some of the planks sticking up above it. And let's scale it on the x-axis so that it fits perfectly or overlaps just a little bit, right like that. And now in side view, let's go in top view. In top view, we want to move this plank in front of the others, like that. So that's what our drawbridge door looks like. Now in front view, press Shift and D to duplicate that, and then press Z to move it straight down to the bottom of the door. Boom. Now select all of these objects by holding Shift and right-clicking, and press Control and J to join them all together into one object. Now we have our door. Let's center it on this blue line here by moving it over on the x-axis. And you know what? It's looking a little bit small, so I'm just going to press the S key, scale it up just a little bit, and then move it up on the z-axis right onto the red line, just like that. And now there's a gap between the wall and the door, so let's just move it back in top view. Press G and then press Y to constrain it to the y-axis and move it flush against the castle wall. There. Looking good. Now let's go ahead and add a floor for everything, or a ground. In top view, press Shift and A, and let's add a mesh plane. Zoom out real far, press S, and scale this up. Just keep on scaling to about that size. So that's our battleground. Now let's add some little cube people with spears. Our little guys are basically going to be made out of a cube that we stretch to be a little bit taller. So in top view, let's add a mesh cube. Press the S key to scale it down to about the size we want our little people to be. That looks about right. And in front view, I'm going to move it up and press the S key and then Z to stretch them tall to about the height we want. And something that looks generally along that size. And let's move it on top of the ground. Right like that. And that scale looks about right to me. Now let's give him a weapon. We're going to give him a spear, which is made pretty much exactly the same way as we made the towers, the corners of the castle. It's going to be a cylinder with a cone for a top. So in top view, left click next to the cube to place the 3D cursor, because that's where we want to add our cylinder. Now press Shift and A again and add a mesh cylinder. Let's scale it down to about the diameter we want the spear shaft to be. And now in side view, Let's move it up and press S and then Z to stretch it tall. We want it to be just a little bit taller than the guy is. Just like that. Now, if you moved your spear away like I did from the 3D cursor, and you're about to add a cone, it's going to add it next to the spear when we really want it perfectly on top. So let's move the 3D cursor exactly to the position of the spear. We can do that by right-clicking on the spear, making sure that's selected, then press Shift and S, and select the option Cursor to Selected. That will move the cursor directly on top of the object that we've selected. Now press Shift and A to add a mesh cone, which is going to be huge to start out with. So in side view, let's scale that puppy down and move it to the top of the spear. Now it's a bit broad. We want this to be longer and sharper. So press S and then Z and just stretch it out. Move it to the top of the spear so that it intersects just a little bit and sits on top. And there's our little spear for our little soldier. Now select the cone, hold Shift, and select the cylinder. Press Ctrl and J to join them together. Now we have our spear. And let's do the same thing to smooth this out that we did with the castle corners. So press the T key for the side menu here, and then press the smooth option. Press the T key again to hide that toolbar, and you'll see the shading on this is still a little weird. So, under the modifier buttons, which is the wrench icon again, let's add that edge split modifier in. And it fixed it. Now let's parent this spear to our cube guy so that we can move the cube around and the spear comes with it. So with the spear selected, hold Shift and select the cube, and then press Ctrl and P and select Object. So now we just parented the spear to our cube soldier. If you move the cube around, the spear comes with it. Now in side view, let's move this cube back just so we can work with it in empty space. Select the spear and let's rotate that about 45 degrees. Because he's attacking the wall, he's not going to be holding it straight up. It's going to be pointing at something that he wants to kill. There, we have our first soldier attacking the wall. Now we're going to add like 20 different soldiers, and we're going to rotate them all so that they're directed towards the door, towards the drawbridge door. All of their focus is going to be on that door, and they're going to be throwing spears up in the air, and it's going to be pretty cool. So first let's position this cube soldier. Go into top view, and simply rotate him so that he's pointing towards the drawbridge door. Just like that. Now select both objects, press Shift and D to duplicate them, and then just do that a couple times. Duplicate them both, rotate them towards the door, and in a random pattern, create a little advancing army. So just select those two objects, press Shift and D to duplicate, move them into an empty space, and press R to rotate them towards the door. Just like that. Let's add a few more. I'm going to press number so we can see the scene with a little bit of perspective. See how cool it's starting to look. Now let's get some of these spears up in the air. Move it up into the air and rotate it like it has a trajectory. It's going up, 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 and then it's leveling out, and then it's coming down straight at the castle walls. So just go through and select random soldier spears, inside view, throw it up in the air, and aim it towards the castle wall. Just like that. Make some of the spears higher than the others and rotate them as if they have a trajectory. So again, I'm just selecting one spear by right-clicking, pressing G to move it up into the air, and then R to rotate it. I'm going into multiple views to make sure they're all kind of aiming at the same target. Just like that. Alright, that does it for setting up the scene. Now let's set up the camera, and then we'll set it up for render. So right-click on the camera, which is this funny little icon here, and you can press numpad 0 to go into camera view. Now this view is not the most flattering view for this scene. So let's go into top view, and let's move the camera behind all of the action, right about there. And let's point it towards the door, just like everything else is pointed. And now press numpad 0 again. And it's capturing some more action now, but we want this to be down towards the ground. Now you can actually move and rotate the camera while you're in camera view, which makes it a lot easier to find the perfect view. So with the camera selected and in camera view, which is numpad 0, press the G key to move it around. And let's move it down towards the ground. Right about there. Now press the R key and you can rotate the view. And if you press R twice for trackball rotation, you have a perfect viewfinder. So I'm going to left click and confirm that. I'm going to move it down towards the ground a little bit more, just for a really dramatic view. And rotate it up a little by pressing R twice again. There. Now there's not quite enough depth to the image, so we're going to change that. If we go up into the Properties window, in the top header, click on the little camera icon. Now we have some camera options, and I'll be going over these options later, but for right now we're just going to focus on focal length. From here we can change how much perspective the camera lens has. So instead of 35, let's make it more extreme by putting it down to 22. There we go. Now the camera's a little bit too far away from the action. We can change that by pressing the G key and then middle mouse clicking, which will move the camera forward and backward. So just move it forward a little. And let's capture this whole scene by getting the tops of those castle towers in view. So let's move the camera back now by pressing G and then middle mouse clicking. And by the way, I'm zooming in and out of the view just like this using the middle mouse wheel. And the only part that's rendered is within this orange square. Everything that's kind of blacked out a little surrounding it is not going to be in the final render. So right now I'm just trying to get everything into view. So just like that, I have the whole castle in the view, I have a lot of the soldiers in view, and the spears up in the air. And I'm really low to the ground. I'm going to move it a little bit even lower to the ground. Rotate it up a little. That looks good to me. Now there's a bit of empty space on the right side. I'm going to add a few more soldiers. So in top view, select a soldier and a spear, duplicate them, And I'm going to add some more soldiers over here, just to fill in that space. Let's see how that looks. That's a little better. There's one big gap right here. There we go. Beautiful. Alright, let's get a few more spears up in the air. Now, I'm just going to take some of these spears that a few of the soldiers are still holding and throw them up in the air with the others. I just want to crowd the air, make this really look like an attack. There, I just added 2 or 3 more up in the air. So now that our scene's set up, we can work on setting up the lighting. But first, let's set it up for a render, and let's see what it looks like as is, because there's already light in the scene. It might look okay. So let's go to the render options, which is the camera icon in the properties window. Left click on that, and here's our render settings. We can set the size of the render here. Right now it's set at 1920 by 1080, and it's going to render it at 50%, which is basically like a preview. And that's fine. Let's leave everything here as is. But let's change one thing. Let's change the display from image editor to new window. That way when we render it, it'll pop up in its own window, and we can close it when we want. So change display to new window, and you can either press the render button here, or you can press F12. Let's see what it looks like. Alright, so that's what we got so far. It's not very good, but we're going to fix that. It's going to look half decent in the end. So press X to close that, and you can press F11 to make that pop back open. So F11 will open up your last render. Let's take one look at it again, and let's see what we want to change. First off, it's too dark everywhere, and I don't want the sky to be gray. I want it to be white. So let's close that. Let's change the lighting first. So that big lamp right there above the castle is what we're going to change. So select the lamp by right-clicking on it. And let's just move it outside the castle so we can work with it in empty space. Now with the lamp selected, let's go into the lamp options, which is this little light icon, and change it from point light to a sunlight. Now I'm going to go over later the different kinds of lighting, but for now we're just going to set up a basic scene, so just follow along. So change it from point to sunlight, and you'll notice that a long line now extends from the lamp. This is the direction of the light, and also the direction of the shadows. If the light is pointing straight down like this, the shadows are going to be directly below the objects. But for a dramatic scene like this, we want some long casting shadows to make it a little bit more dramatic. So in front view, rotate it towards the castle, about right there. That way it's going to have some pretty long shadows being casted, because it's at an extreme angle. And in top view I think we should leave it where it is. It's going to be casting light on the right side of the castle. So the castle walls are going to be casting shadows on top of some of the soldiers. And that's what I want. So let's see how that looks now that we've changed the lighting. Press F12 to render. Alright, we have some lighting on the right side of everything and lots of shadows being casted. There's lots of activity going on with the lighting. But the side of this castle has no illumination at all. It's completely in the dark. It doesn't look good. But we're going to fix that real fast by adding something called ambient occlusion. I'm going to go over later more details about what that is, how useful it is, and how to best use it. But for right now, just consider it to be the instant cool button for Blender. So let's close that render. Let's go into the world options, which is this little globe icon. Left click on that, and first let's change the sky color, which is the horizon color here, by clicking on that gray square, and changing this slider from the dark gray all the way up to white. Now our sky is going to be white. Now let's simply enable ambient occlusion below that. So click on that checkbox and let's press render and see what we got. Now that's looking a lot better. Lighting is still maybe a little bit bright on the right side of the castle, but I kind of like it. It's blown out a little bit. And you can see, you can get the idea of what ambient occlusion is here. It's basically light bouncing off of things. If you look at the corner of the tower where it meets the castle wall, you'll see some shadowing in that corner. And below all the cubes, you'll also see some shadowing around them. That's what ambient occlusion does. The corners of a room will be a little bit darker than the rest of the room. And by the way, you can navigate around an image just the same way you do in the 3D view. You can use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, and middle mouse click to pan it around. Alright, that's not exactly the same as 3D view, but you know how to do it now. Middle mouse click pans the image, scroll wheel zooms in and out, and you can press numpad 1 to go back to 100% view. So that's our first render there. There's a few things we could change, like we can move a couple of these guys over so we can see that tower better. Throw some more spears up in the air. But I think that's a successful first render. So, to save your image, your first render, go into the Image menu and click on Save as Image. Now let's save it as myfirstrender.png. But before we save that, if you scroll down the left side toolbar here, you can see your different save as image options. You have different image types here you can save it as, like a JPEG or a BMP. Different formats like black and white or RGB with an alpha field, and also compression. So set it to the kind of image you want to save. Type in my first render and then press enter. And you just made your first scene in Blender. So close that and let's save this. Press F2 to save as and save it as my first blend. Press enter twice and we finished our first scene in Blender. Congratulations. Now to set this up for a higher quality render, follow my lead here. In the World button still, change Samples under the Gather panel from 5 to 12. The higher the samples, the better the ambient occlusion is going to look, the less grainy it's going to look, but it also increases the render time. Now let's go to the render buttons and change 50% under resolution to 100% so it renders full size. And also change anti-aliasing from 8 to 16. Anti-aliasing smooths out the edges, so putting it to 16 you'll get the smoothest edges possible. And then once you're done with that, you can just render it and then save your image again, and that's it. So now you see with those settings increased, the quality is definitely increased. Everything is much smoother, less grainy, and much better to look at. So let's save that again. Go to Image, Save Image as my first render. And that's it.